Go for it. This is Emily.
Sounds good. Hi, Kate. Awesome. Yeah. So I'm Emily Morshed. My husband, Evan, is also joining us today. Evan races with the Strong Machine Squad. So yeah, I've been kind of roped into adventure racing through Evan at first, but always loved the outdoors growing up and have really come to appreciate the sport and the people. I love the people in the sport, really just the nicest people out there. So excited to bring this group together. And yeah, I currently, I guess, reside in Western Maine. So which is why it kind of looks like a sauna behind me. Elise, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, so I got dragged in or roped in, to put it nicely, through Emily. Emily and I worked together initially, and we've been hanging out ever since. So Emily asked me one day, do you want to go hang out in the woods and go wander and find some stuff? And I said yes, and it's been awesome ever since. I live in Boston, and yeah, I'm excited to get back outdoors and actually like interact with humans. It's been sad. I've been skiing some and hanging out with my family way too much during all this time. And then seeing family every once in a while. Yeah.
Awesome. And these guys have done a couple of Strong Machine races, and they are just our core volunteers. So without them, the races would not happen. And we are so thankful for them devoting their time to this cause. And yeah, with people as solid as they are, races like ours come into existence instead of just existing in our minds. So thank you for that. We also have a couple other components of Strong Machine. Adventure racing is the pro squad, which is 8 of us, including Evan, Glen, Kit, and Kate, myself, and then a couple other folks who I'm sure all of you guys know or will know soon. And we're also working on we'll work on that. Let me introduce. Thank you, Dan. And we also have a development squad that we're going to be launching very soon here, which is going to be the pipeline for folks who want to get more serious about adventure racing and take the next step up from newbie to intermediate advanced. So we're working on that initiative. But in the meantime, I will pass it off to Glen and Kit, who are, I would say, probably the two best at actually doing the training for adventure racing. I think you'll hear they have slightly different strategies for how they train, but they're both, having raced with both of them together, I can tell you that whatever they're doing is highly effective because it's hard to keep up with them. So I'm excited to hear more actually from them about their training. It's something we don't talk about enough as a team, but so important for getting yourself ready for the grueling and multidisciplinary sport that we do. So not easy to figure it out. These two people have. So I'll pass it on to you guys and you can take it away.
Kit, I don't know if you want to get started. I can just introduce myself quickly. I am actually not technically a New Englander. I live in Pennsylvania. So the weather is slightly more balmy here, although we're getting dumped with snow right now. So I guess technically my outdoor training might differ slightly from what you're doing if you're more in the northern parts of New England. But still, winter training is kind of that thing you unfortunately have to do. So hopefully we can provide some insight into that.
All right, and yeah, I'll kind of get us started off too in the talk, but just to introduce myself, my name's Kit, and I live in Vermont. I'm currently actually in Maryland in the snowstorm already as well. My spouse and I just started doing the van life thing for a couple weeks, and we'll keep at it for little pieces here and there throughout the year. But my formal background is actually as an athletic trainer, and I teach at the University of Vermont, and I teach in rehab and movement sciences. So I do instruction for athletic trainers, exercise scientists, and the Department of Physical Therapy. So I teach a lot of training and conditioning in addition to sports medicine, nutrition, et cetera, et cetera. So there's just so much, that that we could talk about, but trying to delimit this to an hour is challenging. So, hopefully we'll be able to get a little bit of the physiological reasons across to you, and then some of the like practical implementation is really where the big keys are for the takeaways. But I am going to share a PowerPoint in my true instructor fashion, if I may. And I think, Glenn, correct me if you want different, but I think feel free to interrupt with questions, and we'll kind of do our best to answer as we go along and just see what we get through today. And if there's like questions on the chat, maybe Cliff, maybe you can moderate or something and interrupt us if that happens, that'd be great. So this is one of my favorite quotes here: "Getting tougher is the process of pushing beyond your perceived limits and realizing you can do more." And this is like adventure race, 101, if you will, right? You learn so much about your body and what you're capable of mentally, physically, emotionally, cognitively, et cetera. So I don't know, I love that quote, so I like to throw it out there. And I like to bold it. There we go. So our agenda today is basic foundations of training, sprinkled in with personal experiences with the implementation. And again, feel free to interrupt with questions. I'm going to take just a little bit of time to kind of talk about basic foundations of training from a scientific standpoint. But here's a big takeaway, and why this is so challenging is that we don't have the best technique. Like, there is no one best technique. It's imperfect. We know a lot about what might not work, and we know a lot about what might work for some people. And so what's really important in terms of training is to get a feel for your own individual response to some of the recommendations, for example, and know what works for you and what doesn't. Some people respond really well to high volume. Some people do not respond well to high volume, and they need to keep it low and high intensity, but decrease the volume. So a lot of what I'm going through is going to be some of, how to define that, but figure out what works best for you. Obviously, fads, be careful of the changing fads, because the science typically doesn't catch up to changing fads for years. So if everybody's like, oh, do circuit training, high reps, low volume, that's the best because that's what we're doing, it doesn't mean that the science backs that up. And in fact, there's current research to show that endurance athletes actually might respond better to low volume, high strength. Again, some research, but again, it might not work for you. Our backgrounds are so incredibly different. Our genetics, our history of training, in terms of cardiorespiratory training, our aerobic system that is for the endurance athletes, most people that have earlier training, the better they do, for long term. So if you don't have an early cardiorespiratory training, you're kind of relying on genetics. And, for some people that doesn't seem fair, but that's kind of the way we're seeing it in the literature anyway. And again, figure out what works best for you. I like this because it kind of summarizes what we know and don't know about some of the literature. So when you're looking at endurance training and some of the most important aspects of training for an endurance event like adventure racing, this one at the bottom, the foundation, is just its volume. It is well established that hours of training pay off. And I'll talk more about that later on. High intensity training may pay off significantly as well. So making sure that you're getting points where you're working really hard within those hours of duration. And then some of these other pieces, like being more specific, training stimuli, tempo training, it all depends on kind of this foundation. So this is the biggest thing that I could stress is you gotta have volume of training, and it's gotta be consistent so that you're taking advantage of those gains that you're making throughout each week that you're working.
I'd say just one thing in as a comment to that volume. If you look at the training of the top adventure racers in the country. Their volume is, at least for me, back when I started racing, it was more than I could even comprehend that someone did that, someone spent that much time training in a week. Now that adventure racing is more of a part of my life, if you will, I can see a little bit more where that time might come from. But there are very few people racing at a high level who have a low volume of training. But I should also say that that if you take your volume of training from where it is and just move it up a couple notches, you definitely see results as well. You don't have to go from 0 to professional, but just increasing your volume of training the slightest bit makes quite a bit of difference if you're committed to what you're doing.
Volume, it needs to start where you're at. Like Glenn is saying, you gotta start where you're at. I'll touch upon that in just a second here. Well, what types of volume? This is a look at a mapping from an elite Nordic skier and the time that they put into each zone. And I'll talk about these zones in case you're not familiar with them in a minute. Most of the training, this is over the course of a year of this person's training. Again, elite Nordic skier, so significant endurance needs. 80% of the time that they're, quote, training, they're at this super low level called zone 1, kind of this recovery zone of training, meaning their heart rate is likely right around 130, 140 beats per minute. This is I can have a full sentence with you while I'm doing whatever I'm training to do, whether it's biking, running, Nordic skiing. So this is how you can start racking up the volume because it's super low intensity, low heart rate, for example. And then you start kind of ramping it up a little bit in intensity, and really low amounts of time is spent at these higher intensities. And I think I mentioned this a little bit later on, but this is kind of amateur mistake 101. When people start training, they're like, I got to go hard, hard, hard every day, right? I'm going to do 5 miles as fast as I can today, and then 3 miles as fast as I can tomorrow, then 6 miles the next day, or 10 miles. And it's the problem with hard, hard, hard is your body doesn't recover. And then this right here is where all your training is in zone 3, because your body's not recovered to be able to do the zone 4, zone 5. And so if you're hanging out in zone 3, there's very, very little evidence to support zone 3 training as a, as a beneficial effect necessarily. So that's why you see all of this. This is almost recovery zone. We usually call it recovery zone. Most of the training here, in order to have those days that you can go really hard and then you recover and you go really hard. If I could stress anything about training and getting out of like probably what the norm might be for many people, that's what I see, is you're going too hard too often.
Yeah. Also, just to echo what Kit's saying, that zone 1 is where you spend almost all of your time during an adventure race. Unless you're doing something wrong, you shouldn't be hitting zone 5 in an AR. That's not a great thing. Something to keep in mind. That's probably your race pace for 80+% of a race, 90% of the race.
Yeah. Basics that I think help with injury prevention and also training: progression, overload, recovery, consistency. I could put like 50 more things here, but these are the ones I wanted to cover today. So progression and overload, kind of tied them in together. So important to begin where you're at right now, not where you want to be. This is a success, well, this is the story for failure right here in terms of likely injury and burnout, is if you're going too hard and you haven't prepared for it. We all have those stories of like, oh, I haven't run for a while, but I'm going to go for 10 miles, and then you have Achilles tendinopathy. You hurt your low back because you used to be able to lift, bench press or squat, whatever, and you're just not there. So make sure you're being realistic and accountable to yourself to begin where you're at, and then progress from there. Tips from the coaching field: don't increase your volume more than 10% each week. So you got to start writing things down to hold yourself accountable to these changes. I measure my volume. These are the parameters for how you can increase your overload. Overload just means making your body do more than it's used to, overloading some system, adding more hours of exercise that week or training, adding a higher intensity of training. So increasing your heart rate for a short period of time, increasing how many days a week you're doing that sport. So instead of running 3 times a week, run 4 times a week. You're overloading in these kind of small chunks. While you're overloading, it has to be progressive though, because the body needs time to adapt. I come from a athletic training background, so I talk a lot about injury and injury prevention. But in that, I also know that the body has mechanical limits. Our tissues, our tendons, our muscles, our fascia, our skin, our bones, we have mechanical limits. And so if you're not progressing through and increasing appropriately, you're going to end up with your tendinopathies, your stress fractures, your myopathies, etc. So progression is probably one of the most important pieces for injury prevention as well. I don't know, Glen. So how do you measure your parameters? Like I said, I like to keep track of my hours every week of what I'm doing, running hours. I don't even do running miles. I just do running hours, biking hours, etc. And I use heart rate usually as my intensity. What do you?
I go, even though I'm a mathematician, I go a lot more on feel. I use a site called Attack Point to log all of my workouts, which gives me a nice visual. If anyone's not familiar with that, it's a free site where you can just log any workout you do. The most helpful part for me is that it just gives me a visual of what I did in bar graph form. But what I try to keep track, just again based on how I feel, as far as if I've done too much or not enough, if that makes sense. And then I kind of fly by the seat of my pants with what I'm doing for training. Not with training. I have blocks of time for training, but as far as what I'm going to do the next day, I often will decide based on the previous day or the previous 2 days worth of training, if that makes sense.
Yeah, in the academic world, we call that rate of perceived exertion, and it is a wonderful measure. It has actually been shown scientifically to be relatively accurate. So, if your rate of perceived exertion is 6 out of 10, you should be right around in that zone 1, zone 2 area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess the part of your question I didn't respond to was as far as like time versus miles. If I'm running, I try to think in terms of time. Like for me personally, like once I get over an hour is when I start, when things start to shift for me into a different style of run, if that makes sense. Once I get over 60 minutes, it becomes a different experience. Biking, I think of more in terms of miles, but running is more time than anything else, because the terrain, if I'm doing trail running, if it's muddy out, if it's raining, if it's cold, the time has a lot more impact than the miles. You can get the same workout with different miles in similar times, if that is understandable.
Yeah. So, and some of it's figure out what works best for you.
Mm-hmm.
So we obviously go a little bit differently on how we measure that. Here's some examples of some goals for what you want to be overloading. If I look at our aerobic endurance, zone 1, zone 2, this is just long, easy, steady runs, bikes, paddles, etc. Muscular forces might be really important. This is just like hills or resistance. Glenn and I and Cliff last year, we were in the C2C down in Florida. There's not a single hill. There's a couple of armadillos that you might have to run over with your bike. You can ask Glenn about that one, but other than that, there's no hills. So we didn't really have to worry too much about this. But if you're racing anywhere up in the Northeast, you're gonna hit the hills. So you got to make sure that you're overloading your body to be able to deal with biking up hills and hiking up hills and down hills. Speed skills, this is just for economy and efficiency. I could speak to that, but I'm not going to today, but maybe on another day. Muscular endurance, incredibly important. This is just getting the muscles used to higher demands. So when we call it zone 3 is really a tempo. If you're a marathon runner, zone 3 is basically the zone you'd be in to complete the race. So if you're an 8-minute miler, 8:30-minute miler, that's your zone 3. We don't really worry about this too much, again, because there's not a lot of evidence to support it, other than figuring out with your muscles, what does it feel like to be in race pace for a long period of time? So it might look like something like this. Zone 4 is a really great place to hang out every few days. And that's your threshold training. I'll talk about that more in a minute. Zone 5, we don't really need to get there often in adventure racing at all. I mean, this is very, very stressful for the system. So it's very few seconds to minutes of stressing the system and kind of teaching it a couple different skills. So I'm not insulting your intelligence here, but I'm just trying to make a point, in terms of what adventure racing is. What's really cool about training for adventure racing is that if you're just outside doing stuff, you're training. Especially even if you're in zone 1, right? I love going for hikes with my family because I'm like, cool, I'm getting some muscular force uphill, even though I'm forced to go slow. It actually helps me to be in zone 1 and not like run up the mountain like I might want to. And then of course the demands are all over the place. So what's important about training, just as important as making sure you're in zone 1, zone 2, zone 4, is that you are training for the specific events, which in adventure racing is just having an adventure outside, so a lot of the importance of getting into these different activities is because you have to make these neuromuscular changes and adaptations in the body. You have to be prepared for all these different movements and these different patterns of movement. Because if your body's not, it will start to move potentially in ways that are not the most efficient, and that can cause injury. So an accumulative effect of not moving in a good pattern is going to be injury of some level. So, we get a lot of questions like, is it better to mountain bike or to gravel bike or to road bike? And I say yes. You do them all, because you're going to do them all in an adventure race. If you're, moderate or high level, there are some races that you can get away with not being off road or anything too much, but you got to get to do it all, and have some fun with it. And, for example, mountain biking, really important because your body has to learn what it's like to be out of the saddle, having those different demands. It doesn't mean it has to be every day, but you have to be able to do that, or else your body starts to break down. It gets inefficient. You're going to feel it at the end of the race. Yeah. You're inefficient. You're not using your energy as well.
I'd say in response to that, someone asked not that long ago, and I forgot the context, the location, like the reason for the ask, but about biking. I would say if you are someone whose biking is not something you grew up doing, you don't do a lot of biking, then mountain biking is probably the most important form of biking in prep for adventure racing. But if you're someone who is familiar with mountain biking, then mountain biking training is not as important. You could get similar effect from road riding. So like growing up, I did some mountain biking, nothing technical, but on my cheap little, like $50 Walmart bike, I would do some mountain biking. So as an adult, when I started mountain biking, it didn't take me that long to understand some of the nuances of it. So now that I've been biking in a lot more for a long time, I spend more time on the road now than I probably do on the trails, just because, there's a couple of reasons, and I guess one of which is something we'll probably talk about later, is the idea that in longer races, there's less time doing like flowy single track, like technical rock gardens, that kind of fun mountain bike stuff. And a lot of it is pavement or gravel roads or dirt roads. So training for those things.
Yeah, I would echo that. I spend way more time on my bike trainer than I wish. But part of it is because I can control my power output. I can control my heart rate better. Versus mountain biking, my heart rate's spiking up, down, up, down. I'm going for great neuromuscular gains, but I'm not going for good zone training necessarily.
It's also important to have fun too. Yeah. So if you like mountain biking, make sure you mountain bike.
Yes. And when it's not mountain bike season, hit the trails on your skis. That's training. You're getting some muscular force, you know, like, so that's what's pretty cool. That's why I love adventure racing, is just being outside is training.
Yeah, actually something you mentioned it a few minutes ago, Kit, and I wanted to build on that when you mentioned the idea of like going for a hike with your family. What I personally I feel that has made a difference is once I realized that part of adventure racing, just being able to do something for a very long time. Like if you're training for a 24-hour race, that's 24 hours that you are on your feet, with maybe the exception of paddling. But like biking is kind of like being on your feet because you're pedaling the whole time. So if you live like a sedentary lifestyle, like you sit at a desk all day, but then you can run like a 5K after work, trying to be on your feet more than that is beneficial. Even if it's not skill specific, walking, standing does have a long-term impact on being able to handle adventure races. Maybe not at the short level, like a 3 or 6 hour race. Even an 8-hour race, you might not feel the gains for that. But if you're doing something longer and your body's used to having to do something, it'll make a difference.
Yeah, one of my favorite workouts, I call it a workout or a training day during a shoulder season, when it's just the trails are gross to bike or run, is I'll throw a 10-pound weighted pack or 15-pound weighted pack, and I take my dog for 2-3 hour walks. Just getting used to having weight on the pack and walk. And that's, I might get up to like 120, 130 beats per minute heart rate, which is very low zone 1, but it's training. I'm teaching my body. Kind of neat. Just being on the feet, like you said there, Glenn. Eccentric demands. This is one's huge. If you're going to be doing hills, if you're going to be on your feet trekking, doing hills, you really should get out and do downhills. It demands more of your body than you would expect if you're not used to hiking up and down. You're going to get the DOMS, the delayed onset muscle soreness, from eccentric work more. When I say eccentric, they're also called negatives. It's when the muscles are working but being stretched. So they're not working and shortening, and they're working and being stretched, and it actually pulls on the muscle fibers as they're trying to kind of slow your body down from not falling. There's been some recent literature to suggest that eccentric work lasts in adaptation for the body for a little bit longer than concentric. So if you're thinking about doing like an adventure race that has a lot of hills, doing eccentric work the week before that race may actually backfire on you, because it does take such a toll on your body. But that's okay, because if you're doing that work prior to the taper, so maybe 10 days before the race, 12 days, 14 days before the race, if you've had some eccentric demand, it tends to last over the course of potentially a couple weeks. Just make sure that you're getting down hills in your training, if there's hills on your course. I'm going to kind of cruise past this one, other than maybe this, right? The closer to the race day, the more you got to start mimicking the race, which is just endurance. Stop worrying about threshold as much. Stop worrying about tempo. Well, I mean, you get closer to tempo and endurance stuff, but if you're a mountain biker and that's all you want to do, you got to get off the trails and start making sure that you're running and biking, doing the multidisciplinary thing, getting some long days in the saddle, see what it feels like. Definitely the closer to the race. Neuromuscular stuff, I don't know, take a screenshot of this if you want. This is just an example of leg endurance stuff. Make sure that you're if you overload your muscles, it's going to help teach your muscles to be prepared for that activity. And so doing some of this work here with the lunges and the split squats, Romanian deadlifts, this is kind of a nice leg endurance circuit that I like to do. Could be beneficial. The problem with this type of stuff is that this is not the demands of adventure racing or of any exercise really, or any race. So it's rarely done in isolation. But if you do get injured, or if you're in your recovery or rest week, that's a great place to do some of these circuits and focus on this neuromuscular training stuff. This, a lot of the stability work, when I say it really happens in isolation, you're not doing planks during an adventure race. And a lot of us, I'll speak for myself, I struggle to do some of that low level stuff, except when I'm injured. And then I'm like, great, now I can return to stability and start working, from the bottom up. Other than that, I'm making sure that things are timed appropriately so that when I get on the kayak, I'm using my serratus anterior and my, core muscles, if you will, appropriately while I'm on the kayak. And so that's where I'm working a lot of the endurance stuff. Injury prevention right here, pelvic stability. I can talk about that in a different talk. So here we get into the science again. Zone training. This is the percentages that you can use for these zones. And I told you already, 80% of your zone, what we're kind of seeing in some of the best racers is it works for them to have 80% of their training in recovery to endurance. So this means that their power output is no greater than 75% of their max threshold. Or if you're doing a heart rate training, so your max heart rate, if you want to estimate it, it's about 220 minus your age. It's a really rough estimate. But if you take that number, 220 minus your age, and put it into these percentages, that's one way that you can estimate what zone am I training in for today. It's a rough estimate. You could use RPE, rate of perceived exertion, kind of what Glen's doing, just by feel. How do I feel? Do I feel like I'm in this endurance zone? Am I having a conversation with people? Or am I in threshold? I'm 105% of my max. So I'm like, 190 beats per minute heart rate. That means you're working really hard. You're in threshold training. This is just an Excel spreadsheet. So I used FTP of 185. That's my FTP right now. My heart rate max is right around there. Again, it's an estimate. So that I know while I'm on my bike trainer, I take my heart rate and I say I'm supposed to be in zone 2. I'm in threshold right now. That means I'm not recovered, or vice versa. It kind of works that way for me to measure the heart rate. Do you do power training? Do you have a power meter, Glen?
So for anyone hearing about bike training getting nervous, you have to buy stuff. My bike trainer setup is the cheapest, most rattiest thing you will ever see. I bought a trainer on clearance from a bike shop that was closing. It has like a Bluetooth speed sensor, and I hooked it up once and it said I was riding 160 kilometers an hour. And the bike, don't tell bike people this, but it's like a size small, like Walmart road bike that I took the handlebars off and put something else on so I can sit on the bike. And I go by perceived exertion, just how I feel on the bike. It's comical to watch, but it's getting the job done.
And this is just experience talking over years of figuring out what works for him. Mm-hmm. So yeah. I'm telling you, science, the science around this is not a perfect match. As a professional, if I were talking to him, I'd be like, you should have the bike that you race on your bike trainer, because you're going to get these neuromuscular gains for exactly where you're supposed to be. And it prevents injury, blah, blah, blah. But, Glen is a very high impact racer, and what he found out works for him.
Yeah, it really it works for me because I never used to have a trainer. So I've had it for about 2 years. And this is like revolutionary to me. Like I can ride a bicycle inside the house. That is crazy. Even though it's not the best. And I guess that goes to, you gotta, like we say in adventure racing about gear, like you gotta like use the gear you have, like run what you got. And like the gear that I have is like a $60 bike trainer setup. So that's what I'm running with for now. Yeah, the fanciest gear in the world, the fanciest training gear will not make you the best racer. It's how you use it.
Power meters can be relatively cheap, or they can be super ridiculously expensive. I made huge gains with a $65 power meter for a couple of years, and now I have the Wahoo kicker now, so it comes with the power meter in it. But so even if you have a rinky-dink setup, if you are using a bike trainer, you can get pretty cheap power meters out there to help you monitor this. If you want to try this as your training, which I would recommend, it's a good place to start until you really get to know your body a little bit more, like Glenn does. Okay, recovery. This is where the adaptations occur. You don't get stronger, faster, more endurance by doing those activities. The body doesn't adapt to that activity until after you do it. You have to have recovery or decreased demands of the tissue in order for that overload that you had to change in your body, in order for the tissues to get stronger, in order for your mitochondria to get larger, for your capillary density to increase. For those changes to happen, they need time and they need decreased demands. And so what recovery looks like, I kind of mentioned earlier on, is after going a very hard day, have an easy day or two, and then go very hard again, and then an easy day or two. If you're hard, you're not having the recovery, you're not having the adaptations, we see the burnout, the injury, and you don't make the gains. What it might look like so that's kind of like what it would look like every week, right? Is an easy day followed by a hard day, just huge approximation. Every 3 to 5 weeks, having a week of lower volume is really important as well. So you go 3 weeks where you're gaining 10% each week, another 10%, another 10% of volume, and then you go down to like, if you're doing like a 9-hour week, then a 10-hour week, then 11, then a 14 or 12 or whatever, then you go back down to 8 hours. And then you come back up to, okay, 12 hours, 13 hours, 15 hours, go back down to 8 hours. You got to have those macro recovery weeks, again, for the body to adapt. And that's been pretty well documented in the literature to help prevent injury and burnout and increase your gains.
Yeah. I'd say the practical application of that is to fit that schedule around what your schedule is. So like if you've got a busy week, that sounds like a good week for recovering. And if you have a week where you have nothing in the afternoons or evening, that sounds like the kind of week where you can increase your volume. But yeah, trying to, like, the times that I've been the most frustrated with my training are when I try to fit training into time I didn't have in my schedule. So just figuring out what your schedule is. Like, crap, I've got a really busy week next week. I have I'm a teacher. I have 3 meetings after school. I have to stay late that day. I've got an appointment at 5 o'clock. I might get in 4 hours of training next week. So I'm going to try to increase my volume this week so my rest week next week is effective. The times that it doesn't work is when I take a rest week and then I realize that by default I have another rest week after that. And then I've essentially wasted 2 weeks of training because I'm not getting any positive gains from my rest.
That brings us right to consistency. Good segue. Take advantage of your training days and your training weeks, the ramp ups that you're potentially doing. In the literature, you might read about the super compensation phase that occurs in the body. And it's when the body gets ready to meet the demands that you just asked of it a couple days ago. So if you do a really hard training day, you do a threshold training day, your heart rate's 120% for 4 minutes at a time with 4 minutes recovery, whatever. The next day, you're exhausted. You can't do it again. Hopefully, if you did it right, you shouldn't be able to do it again the next day, or do it very well anyway. But the following day, so let's say my threshold day is on a Monday. Tuesday, I'm exhausted. I take a rest day or a recovery day. Recovery doesn't mean rest. Recovery means not taxing the muscles as much or not taxing the system as much. So Tuesday's a recovery day. Wednesday, my body is like, wow, I was stressed on Monday. What happens if I get stressed today? I got to be ready to meet that demand. And it's kind of this almost golden point where you can take advantage of that overload because the body's ready to hit it again, hit it hard, and now start to make the changes necessary to meet that demand that you asked of it. So if you're training hard on Monday, by Wednesday, your body might be in the super compensation phase where if you train hard again, it's going to start compensating and say, I got to get ready for that level of demand. And then by Friday, you might be ready for another super compensation. This is all individual. You have to figure this out with your coach or with your own body. or heart rate. Again, if I'm trying to go for a hard threshold day and in my warm up, I'm at like 170, I'm like, I'm not recovered because I'm not putting the power output that I should be, for getting this high heart rate. Some people, it might be a Monday and a Thursday is when their super compensation is. But if you're going Monday and then you're not doing anything for the rest of the week and you want to make changes in your threshold, you're going to lose it. You're going to lose that opportunity of your hard day. And so we start to call that detraining. A lot of times you'll do blocks of training. So in a 4-week block, you're focused on threshold. So you're doing 2 threshold or 2 zone 4 days a week. Some people do 3 zone 4 days a week. You really got to progress up to that. If you do 3 zone 4 days a week for 4 weeks, and then you have your recovery week, that's a block, and you focused on threshold. And then maybe your next 4 weeks, you're focusing on muscular endurance. Add a threshold day once a week, maybe. Piece. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit here, but the point is, if you've made gains long periods of time without doing that load that you just taught the body to do, is going to detrain your body. So you kind of look at this, right? If you reduce 10%, there's very little detraining effect that happens. But if you just sit and watch Netflix all day, over the course of 2-3 days, it's going to be really hard to retrain your body back up. It could take months before you're getting back up to your fitness. Don't be scared if you get sick and stuff, because it tends to be like over a week or 2 weeks of detraining that have like the real significant effect. You just have to deal with sickness in that way.
And just to build on what Kit said again, the idea, like if you break that down at its most basic, where you do a hard workout, you rest for a day, and then you do another hard workout the following day. Again, at its most basic, that's where you build that into your own schedule. So I know on my schedule, I can get a long bike ride in on Saturday or on one of the days of the weekend, sometimes both days if I'm lucky. And if I do it both days, I will take Monday and Tuesday for a light, easy workout, and I'll pick up my intensity on Wednesday. But if I get one in on Saturday, Sunday I'll do something light, and then I can pick up my intensity maybe on Monday. But again, that's based on my schedule. That's how my time works. That's when I have time to do things. If you have time on a Tuesday to do a long, harder workout where you can have a high threshold, then you schedule that differently.
I don't know if you guys are recording this already, but I would recommend writing down what you're doing. It helps to look. This was just a week that I did a while ago. It keeps you accountable to yourself for what you're actually doing over the course of the week. And these are just different activities that I've, kind of thrown in here that I like to do. I might look at the stability piece, and like, if it's empty for 2 weeks in a row, I'm like, crap, I gotta start making sure I'm focusing on stability for the next couple of weeks. Or, biking, I can keep track of how many minutes I biked this week, and am I ramping it up? Did I only bike once, twice? And this can be helpful for seeing what works for you and what doesn't work for you. So I know Glenn said he uses a tack point. I like to write down my minutes. These are minutes of training or just activity in each of these. And did I do a threshold training? Yeah, I was able to do it Tuesday and Thursday of this week. And I met my goal, of 10.5 hours or so of training for that week. That's actually it, unless we wanted to poke into some nutrition stuff from what I had to share from the PowerPoints. Anyway, so Glenn, did you want to?
This is just something I thought of earlier, but I was thinking of a good time to throw it in. So now might be a good time. Training for adventure racing. It's also important that you try to train for the race that you like train for the race that you're doing. So, I've been racing for about 8 years. And in September, I did my first race because everything was canceled. My first race in 8 months, and it was a short race. And I'm more familiar these days with longer events. It was a 5-hour race, and knowing the style of race, if I did it at my max pace for an adventure race, it might be a 3-hour event. So I was training for a sprint adventure race for about the month and a half prior to that, where I was upping my speed because I knew that I wanted to go fast in that race. On the converse of that, in 4 weeks, heading back to Florida for the C2C. And the C2C is, at its most basic, just a bike ride across the state of Florida, a flat bike ride. So I have been focusing on spending a lot of time sitting on my bike seat, because that is the skill that I need, that is the most necessary for that race. Now, a lot of races, there's no like specific thing. For example, like the Wildlands in October, great race, but there's no one specific thing you need to be training for. It wasn't like it was all paddling or all biking. After doing the race, I know that training for unseasonably hot temperatures and dehydration would have been helpful. But as Kit's been saying, that's a different talk.
It is,
Thank
but
you guys so much for this. We have some questions. I didn't mean to interrupt, Kit. Do you have anything else on your mind?
no, I was going to say it's just as important training for the heat. And I see a question about sleep deprivation and whether we train for sleep deprivation. And
Yeah.
Just go rested into the ring.
I was going to ask actually about sleep as a part of this, because to me, one of the most interesting things I notice on Attack Point is some people log their sleep. And I always wondered, I think the question I had around sleep was, if you have to choose between training or sleep, what do you choose? Like, how important is sleep in terms of the active or passive recovery process? Is it just as important, more important, less important than getting that extra hour of workout in?
the scientific answer, sleep every time. The gains that you make from an appropriate night of rest will far outweigh, unless if you're not exercising for 10 days in a row because you only can exercise 10 to 11 at night, whatever, you got to figure that out. But there was a study done of basketball players and looking at their free throw percentage. And they had it was a varsity Division I basketball, a couple basketball teams, and they recorded their free throw percentage getting 8 hours of sleep a night versus 9 hours of sleep. And it improved more than 10% by them getting just 1 extra hour of sleep a night. Not skill-based, just from sleep. Men, the amount of testosterone that comes at night, so when you're talking about muscular development, is huge. You can just improve your testosterone by getting appropriate sleep. Human growth hormone gets released during your sleep. Like, it's all these gains that you need to make during the sleep. So that's the scientific answer. The hard answer is in adventure racing, if you're not prepared for sleep deprivation, you're going to not be successful. So yeah, you have to be prepared for it at some point. But the worst thing to do to train for sleep deprivation is to actually get into sleep deprivation. It's a hard question.
Yeah. So can I tell you all an embarrassing story? So I'll start by saying I'm a bad sleeper. I've never been a good sleeper. To put that into context, if I get 6 hours of interrupted sleep in a night, that's a really good night of sleep for me. Where I wake up 4 or 5 times, I go to the bathroom twice. I just don't sleep. But I think it was actually Kate. I think Kate mentioned this just a moment ago. Getting sleep leading up to a race is as important as is more important than getting like great sleep on the night before a race. I say that because I did a race yesterday, a 9-hour race in Virginia, where the temperatures were more like northern Maine. And I had to leave my house at 3:40 in the morning. And I got 0 sleep the night before. I could not fall asleep. So when I arrived at the race, I had been awake already for about 28 hours. But I had I had excellent sleep the previous 2 weeks, where I had a consistent bedtime, a consistent routine, and I was well rested. and it made a big difference. I was a little foggy. I was tired, but there's a difference between tired and non-functional, and I certainly fell into tired. So it's hard to train sleep deprivation. It really is. Some people would say, like, you can't train it, but if you do it a lot, you get better at it. But you just kind of have to do it, but not train for it. Just do it.
So I think we can do a whole separate session on sleep, especially sleep in expedition races and sleep deprivation. I think that's definitely a topic that has a lot of interest out there. Kit, are you done with the presentation? I might steal the screen back so we can go into see everyone.
Well, and Kasha had a question.
Well, yeah, we'll do Kasha's
cool.
question once we.
And anybody else who has questions, definitely throw it into the chat there. That's a great way to.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So Kasha, I don't know, do you want to jump in and ask your question yourself, or you want me to just read it? I can just read it. You're not
Either
shy.
way, I was just wondering how you guys determine weekly training goals. Yeah, that's my question.
I'll go first because I have the non-scientific answer. My goal is often just based on what I want to get out of the week. So this is not a joke. I'll approach a week thinking I really did not run much last week, so I should probably get 3 runs in this week, 3 or 4 runs, and I should make them good runs. Like, I haven't done a long run in a while. Let me see if I can get 2 long runs in this week, 2 90-minute runs. And I base my week off of something like that. It's not scientific. But again, I know how my body reacts to those things because I've been doing it for a while. So I'll know, like, my legs feel really good this week. And I'm able to kind of get that sense. Like, my legs feel good. I'm gonna put in a hard week on foot. Or my legs feel like they're made of old poopy concrete. So we'll be focusing on the upper body this week.
This is great, Glenn. I'm like, one technique that you could do is whatever race you have coming up in a couple months or a couple weeks, whatever, figure out the time demands that you have for that race. Potentially, this doesn't work for everybody, but then work your way backwards, decreasing 10% to a point that you're at a level where your normalcy is your base. So let me work from a different angle, actually. So think about your normal week right now. If you don't document your hours, try to come up with an estimation of how many hours you're putting in a week. And so if you're putting in 4 hours a week this week, start there. 10%, add 10%, maybe do 5 hours next week, and then 6 hours the next week. It's kind of it is non-perfect science, so you have to see how you feel. And in addition, this is where it starts to get really complicated. You can safely put way more hours on by biking and rowing and swimming than you can running and being on foot. So in terms of injury prevention. So, if you're a marathon, for example, marathon runner, you're really taught not to put any more than 3 hours in prior to the race. 2 hours is basically your long run. You get to 2 hours because time on foot, the cumulative effect of time on foot can be much more damaging to the body than the cumulative effect of biking. 6 hours biking, that's fine. Your legs can handle that as long as you're biomechanically sound. Versus 6 hours of running, you're going to start breaking down. That said, you have to learn how to do that for adventure racing, potentially, at least be on foot for 6 hours. So you start to think about where you're at. Do I want to increase biking a lot? Maybe go more than 10%. If I'm going to increase running, don't go more than 10% each week. But start from where you're at and then start building to see how your body responds to it. If you go multiple weeks in a row with being only at 3 hours, don't jump up to 10 hours. Moderate level to advanced level racers, you'll typically see them, and so non-pros will be putting in between like 10 and 14 hours a week in this sport. So it's not this astronomical number. And then as you get closer to like an expedition, then it goes up to potentially 20 to 30 hours a week. Some of it depends on the time. I do not put that time in.
So you brought up in kind of obliquely an interesting point, which there's a Swedish researcher who's an adventure racer who is studying team training. And just based off my experience at C2C with you guys, I really felt my weakness was biking. So this year I've really dedicated myself to improving my biking training and noticed some big gains on it. It's never really been a focus. My training has always been more of a runner. So another interesting component of all this, which we can maybe discuss in a future session if there's interest, is collaborative training. And if you've got a set group of people that you're training with, training to each other's strengths. And what this Swedish researcher is looking at is, does it make sense for everyone to just be specialists, or does it make sense for the whole team to practice, paddling together, et cetera, et cetera. And he's studying it in AR context. It's super interesting. I can't remember his name, but it's Michael something. He's got there's one TA1 podcast that he was in that's super fascinating that goes into that a little bit, but maybe I can do some more research, or if this piques anyone's interest, if they do some more research on this and get some stuff for us, they can share it with the AR club. But it's a whole other kit and caboodle when you're talking about racing as a team, because you can be a 7-minute mile runner. It doesn't matter if you don't stay with 100 feet of your teammates unless you're going solo. So that really brings a whole other element into this, which is worthy of further conversation, especially with your teammates. I don't want to take too much longer, but would be happy to answer some more questions, and then we can kind of sign off. If anyone has any questions on training, these guys clearly know their stuff, so they're at your disposal. And then also you can always try us, use the AR Club discussion group as your personal sounding board for questions that you can share in a safe space and not necessarily put out to the entire world on Facebook.
I know in the past, sometimes we've shared our attack point profiles for people who are on attack point. That way, if you want to just sort of see what people are doing when they're kind of doing AR focused training. So maybe we can put that in the, that's an easy way to, it's attackpoint.org or ar.attackpoint.org is a really nice way to just kind of peruse other people's training profiles and see what people are doing each week.
Yeah, there's a lot of people in the sport are there, so you can really see what different people at different levels are, what they're training on and what they're doing, and keep track of your buddies as well and how they're training. And if you see someone slacking, you can give them some ribbing and motivate them to double down. Cool. Well,
we have a question from Marty, which is a nice, really important one about really just paddle training in general. It's hard, especially when you live in a place with a long winter, as certainly we do in Maine. I know even just, so I work with a coach, and she was saying, like, my first race is in Oregon in May. And she's like, can you even get out on the water until, April? The answer is no. So yeah, how do you train for paddle when you can't paddle all the time? Any thoughts on that? So Marty mentioned rowing machine or swimming, but any thoughts on cross training for paddle?
So I admittedly never did much paddle training, and it was never a problem in shorter races. Anyone watching this can fight their way through a 10-mile paddle, or a 15-mile paddle. But when you get into longer races, where you might see like a 40-mile paddle, it's painful if you haven't put in paddle training at all. I didn't do much. I would do just, like some generic upper body stuff, and I didn't have much success paddling. What I did recently, Marty, I constructed my own kayak erg out of an old Nordic track. I got a Nordic track for $60 off of Craigslist, and bought maybe like $20 to $30 worth of stuff from Lowe's or Home Depot, pulleys and ropes and things. And it's pretty effective. I use it for, I've never used it for more than 45 minutes. It's much harder than actually paddling. So I will use it for 30 minutes. And it's pretty effective. I try to up the tension and I'll paddle slow, but I focus on form as well. trying to get some muscle memory. I know that the first time everyone grabs a kayak paddle, the form is atrocious, where you just move all elbows and no core. So trying to improve my form is what I've been focusing on over the last month or so whenever I use that. It's also great for me to use on my recovery days. If my legs are tired and I needed to, I did a really hard workout on Sunday and it's Monday, rather than doing nothing, I'll paddle. And I don't mean paddle outside, I mean paddle in my family room for 30 minutes or so.
Kit, maybe you can talk about some specific exercise, but in the meantime, I would say for people who don't have a lot of experience paddling, probably the best thing you can do for paddle training is watching good paddlers on YouTube and learning proper form. Because if you're using proper form, you're gonna go faster and hurt less and be able to travel farther more efficiently just by knowing what a proper paddle stroke looks like. That's worth its weight in training hours, is using proper form for paddling. I mean, it is one of those things where form goes a long way in not just your speed, but your ability to not hurt yourself.
Yeah, and your endurance, your ability to hold a cadence for a long time.
Like Glenn said, you can gut your way through a 10-mile paddle, but if you really want to be, if you want paddling to be something that you're decent at across adventure races, form is so key.
And then train your core, because that's where your power comes from.
Yeah. But there are I'm sure, Kit, certain exercises that you can do, whether it's weights or resistance, that can train paddling muscles. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
yes, yeah, I do a lot of rotational stuff with like TheraBand or resistance band training. So a lot of I can't really show them here, unfortunately, but I could probably put some stuff together and post it. You're really working on stability of your shoulder blade and your shoulder in with your core, and then of your abdomen staying over the pelvis. There's some specific exercises that can be helpful. I'm not going to get out in the water until sea to sea. I haven't been out in the water since November. So I used to do the rower erg, but since I'm not going to the gym because of COVID, I'm just focused on TheraBand resistance exercises and a lot of stability that includes my upper body.
Okay, guys, it's 9:10. Are there any other questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace until you post it on Facebook. All right, great. Thank you guys so much for presenting and for attending. Glenn, Kit, that was a great way to kick this off. If you have any other desires, I know we saw navigation was a popular topic. If you have anything else, feel free to email us or put it on the Facebook group. Thank you guys for starting this series off on such a high note. We're gonna keep going with this through the winter and try and aim for every other weekend if Sunday night at 8 works. We're recording these, so that gives you a little more flexibility if you can't make them. I sprung for the Zoom Premium account, so can record.
We're gonna use it.
So great. Thank you guys so much for attending, and we'll hope to see you at future events. And then one day in the not too distant future, we hope in person for some live training, meetups, socialization,
and racing.
So thanks. Good night, guys.
Bye.